If you breathe too deeply up here during a deep freeze, you can actually feel the moisture in your lungs start to crystallize. The cold doesn't just kill you, it actively hunts you down.
Back in the winter of 1886, the cold was a straight-up executioner. History calls it the Great Die-Up.
Entire frontier towns were buried under 20 feet of snow.
Just stepping outside your front door meant risking your life.
But for a guy named Silas Vance, that kind of extreme isolation was exactly what he was looking for. Silas was a trapper who'd spent the last 7 years totally disconnected from the world. He figured the mountain, as cruel as it was at least honest with him. He lost his wife and little girl to a cholera outbreak years ago. That tragedy hollowed him out completely. He swore he'd never be responsible for another human life again.
It was mid-December, and the sky had turned this bruised, sickly shade of purple.
The air pressure was dropping so fast it made your head ache. A massive blizzard was coming. He was out checking his final snare line, rushing to grab whatever meat he could before the storm locked him inside for weeks. It was already 20 below zero. As he moved through the frozen pines, something totally unnatural caught his eye. A smear of fresh crimson on the pristine snow. It wasn't even frozen solid yet. Silas knelt down and pulled off his mitten. He looked closer at the tracks around blood. They weren't from an elk or a wolf. They were human footprints, and they were small. Nobody came up this high in winter. It was a literal death sentence. Against his better judgment, he started following the erratic, stumbling trail into the wind. Half a mile later, he found them, tucked under the roots of a massive, overturned cedar tree. It was a woman, clutching 2 little kids to her chest. She was trying desperately to shield them from the biting wind. She was an Apache woman, her hair coated in thick ice. Her lips were a dangerous shade of blue. The kids were dangerously still. She didn't plead or cry. She just glared at him with this fierce, terrified defiance, holding a rusted revolver. Silas slowly raised his empty hands. He wanted to show he meant no harm. He recognized the signs of severe hypothermia right away. The violent shivering had stopped. That meant their bodies were giving up, and they only had minutes left. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He stripped off his heavy bearskin coat. He wrapped it entirely around the 2 little girls. It created a thick, protective cocoon against the freezing wind. He reached down and pulled the woman to her feet. She was completely drained. She collapsed against him, and he had to support her weight. The storm was raging around them, threatening to bury them all. The journey back to the cabin was just agonizing. The wind was screaming, tearing at their skin like shattered glass. Silas carried the youngest girl in his arms. He dragged the mother and the older girl through the rising snowdrifts. They finally made it to the clearing. They crashed through the heavy wooden door of his cabin. Just as they got inside, the blizzard hit the mountain with full force. It was deafening. Silas immediately went to work. He stoked the iron stove until it glowed a dull cherry red. The tiny cabin started to fill with this desperate, life-saving warmth. He knew better than to put them right next to the fire. Warming frozen flesh too quickly causes excruciating pain and tissue damage. Instead, he wrapped them in thick wool blankets. He let them thaw out slowly. He brought them lukewarm broth made from dried elk meat. It helped raise their core temperatures safely. For hours, nobody spoke. The only sound in the cabin was the roaring wind outside and the ragged, shallow breathing of the survivors. She finally started getting some color back in her cheeks. A heavy silence in that tiny cabin finally broke. She told me her name was Nalin, and her little girls were Elu and Tiva. I figured they just took a bad turn or got lost in the whiteout. But what she said next made my blood run cold. They weren't lost up here by accident. They were running for their lives. She lived near a mining town, just trying to scrape by. Her quiet life got blown to pieces when she saw something she shouldn't have. A bounty hunter named Cobb ambushed a gold transport and killed the guards. Cobb knew the town would blame an Apache woman, so he framed her. He slapped a massive bounty on her head. Enough cash to make desperate men do horrific things. He needed her dead to save his own neck. He got a posse together and hunted her for 3 straight days. She fled into the peaks, knowing their horses couldn't make the climb. She hoped the terrain would scare him off. But Cobb was too scared to let it go. I walked over to the frosted window and stared out into the whiteout. I felt that old suffocating panic grabbing my chest again. I spent years running from the pain of losing my family. Now, death was knocking on my door. The smart play was to give him food and kick him out when the storm broke. I could save my own skin. But then I looked at little Elu, asleep under my blankets. I saw the ghost of my own little girl. I knew if I sent them back out there, they were dead. If I let Cobb take him, I'd be no better than the sickness that took my family. Right then, I made my choice. I was going to protect them. But I knew this cabin wasn't safe anymore. Cobb was a tracker, and he'd eventually spot the smoke from my chimney. If we stayed boxed up in this little wooden room, we were sitting ducks. We'd be cornered and slaughtered. We had to disappear into the mountain before those hunters showed up. I knew about a hidden spot a mile higher up. A network of geothermal caves I found a few years back. It was a gamble, but it was our only shot. Next morning, the storm finally broke. It left this creepy dead calm over the whole mountain. But the temp dropped to like 35 below. Silas knew this was their only shot to make a run for it. Before stepping out, Silas handed Nalin his spare rifle. She grabbed it tight, locking eyes with him. No words needed. They bundled the girls onto the sled, wrapping them in every blanket they had. The hike up that mountain was pure agony. The snow was waist deep. Silas had to literally carve a path through the drifts with his own body. Every step burned calories they just couldn't afford to lose. Nalin was incredibly tough. Whenever they stopped, she'd wrap her girls' feet in dried moss she pulled from dead trees. It's this old trick to build an insulating barrier. Kept the frostbite from creeping in. She wouldn't let Silas do all the heavy lifting either. She grabbed those sled ropes right alongside him. Together, they just leaned into that biting wind, pushing higher and higher up those peaks. They finally hit the hidden ravine just as the wind started screaming again. The cave entrance was barely a crack in the rock, totally hidden behind this massive curtain of blue icicles. You'd never see it from the valley. Soon as they slipped inside, the brutal cold just vanished. The air in there was damp, earthy, and like 50 degrees, warmed by these deep underground vents. After all that freezing agony, it felt like an absolute miracle. But that relief didn't last long. Down in the valley, Cobb and his guys had survived the first wave of the storm. Cobb was losing his mind with paranoia. He knew if Nalin lived, he was going to hang. Driven by pure panic, Cobb forced his freezing men back out into the snow. Promised him double the bounty just to keep him moving. By mid-afternoon, they stumbled right up to Silas's cabin. Cobb didn't even hesitate. He stepped inside and scanned the room. The stove was cold, but he spotted discarded bandages on the floor. He knew exactly what that meant. They had made a run for it, heading straight up the deadliest part of the mountain. One of Cobb's men finally hit his breaking point.
His hands were completely frostbitten, and he refused to take another step. He begged the others to turn back, saying the mountain was a death sentence. But Cobb wasn't about to negotiate. Driven by his own paranoid fear of the gallows, he didn't even hesitate. He drew his weapon and ended the argument right there in the snow. Cobb turned his icy stare on the rest of the posse. He made it crystal clear that turning back wasn't an option. If they wanted to get off this mountain alive, they had to go through the woman. Meanwhile, up in the hidden cave, reality was setting in. The geothermal heat kept them from freezing to death, but the darkness was absolute. They couldn't risk building a fire, because the smoke would lead Cobb right to them. Without a fire, getting drinking water became a miserable process. Silas had to pack fresh snow from the cave entrance into a leather canteen. It was a slow, agonizing way to survive. To melt the snow, he placed the freezing canteen right against his bare skin. He tucked it deep inside his heavy coat, using his own body heat. He shivered violently, literally draining his own core temperature to keep them hydrated. Food was strictly rationed in the dark. They survived on tiny strips of tough elk jerky. They even chewed on bitter pine needles just to keep the scurvy away. The days just started blurring into one long, dark void. To keep the kids from panicking in the pitch black, Nalin pulled them close. She started whispering old stories about her ancestors. Her voice became this steady, rhythmic comfort, echoing off the damp walls. Silas just sat there in the shadows, listening to her. For the first time in 7 years, that crushing numbness inside him started to fade. He actually felt a strange, forgotten warmth in his chest. Watching them huddled together in that dim light changed something in him. His vow to never care for anyone again was completely broken. He wasn't just a ghost haunting the mountains anymore. He was their protector. By the 5th day, the storm outside was screaming again. But then, Silas heard something else. A faint, sharp clink. Metal striking solid rock. Down in the ravine, Cobb and his men were searching the rock faces. They were freezing to death, and they knew it. Their only hope was finding the shelter Silas had found. It was pure, desperate madness driving them out. Inside the cave, Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed his Winchester. He looked over at Nalin. No words were needed. They both knew what was coming. Nalin pulled her girls deep into the darkest corner of the cave. She gripped her rusted revolver tight. If those men came through that entrance, she was ready. She'd fight to her last breath. Silas crept up to the narrow entrance. He peered through a gap in the thick blue icicles. Outside, the whiteout was blinding. He scanned the storm, looking for movement. Through the howling wind, he spotted them. 3 figures, stumbling through the deep snow. Just 50 yards away. They looked like walking corpses. They were barely surviving the cold. Cobb was leading the pack. His face was blackened with severe frostbite. His coat was completely caked in ice. He was swinging his head wildly, hunting for them with pure desperation. He wouldn't stop until he found them. Silas knew a direct firefight was emotional distress. If he fired from the cave, they'd know exactly where to look. They'd swarm the entrance in seconds. He had to let the mountain do the killing. Silas slipped out of the cave and into the storm. He moved like a shadow against the dark rock. The wind instantly tore right through his layers, but the adrenaline masked the freezing pain. He scrambled silently up a steep snowbank, fighting through the waist-deep drifts. He positioned himself high above the narrowest part of the ravine, right where Cobb and his men would have to cross. Silas waited in the freezing wind until the men were right under the ice overhang.
He didn't aim at them.
He aimed at the massive snow cornice clinging to the cliff above. He pulled the trigger.
The gunshot cracked like thunder, echoing off the canyon walls.
The bullet shattered the delicate ice, and a terrifying groan vibrated through the rock. Before the men could even raise their weapons, the mountain gave way. Tons of packed snow and ice collapsed into the ravine in a violent avalanche. 2 of Cobb's men were instantly buried under 10 feet of hard snow. But Cobb was a survivor. He threw himself backward at the last second, barely missing the crushing force of the avalanche. He scrambled to his feet, coughing up snow, and locked eyes on Silas up on the ridge. Screaming in raw fury, Cobb raised his rifle and fired blindly through the storm. A bullet grazed Silas's shoulder, tearing through his heavy coat and drawing blood. The sudden pain forced Silas to drop low against the rock. Silas ducked behind a boulder, his hands shaking violently from the cold. He tried to cycle his Winchester, but the mechanism was frozen solid. The metal was jammed with ice, leaving him completely unarmed. Realizing Silas had stopped firing, Cobb started marching up the slope. His frost-bitten face twisted into a horrific grin of triumph. He was freezing and exhausted, but pure hatred pushed him forward through the snow. Silas backed away, drawing his hunting knife as a last resort. Cobb reached the top of the ridge and leveled his rifle right at Silas's chest. He opened his mouth, ready to deliver one final venomous word of victory. But Cobb had pushed his body way past its absolute limit. Suddenly, a violent shiver racked his entire frame, and his eyes went wide with confusion. The rifle slipped from his numb fingers and clattered against the rocks. Silas watched in stunned silence as severe hypothermia took complete control. Cobb dropped to his knees, staring at his own hands like they belonged to someone else. He let out a rattling breath and slumped forward into the snow, completely motionless. I just stood there for a minute, letting the freezing wind hit me. My shoulder was burning where the bullet grazed my coat. I had to walk over and make sure he was actually gone, leaving him out there to the mountain. I started the long climb back down. Every single step felt like lifting a boulder. I was running on empty, just desperate to get back to that cave. When I finally pushed through those massive icicles at the entrance, I was staring right down the barrel of a gun. Nalin was waiting in the shadows. She was ready to fight to the bitter end for her girls. The second she saw it was me, all that fierce defiance just melted away. She lowered the gun, and you could see this massive wave of relief wash over her. We actually made it. I dropped my knife on the rocks and just collapsed against the cave wall. I didn't have an ounce of strength left in me. I looked at her and just whispered that it was finally over. That storm kept raging for another 3 weeks, burying the whole valley in a solid white tomb. Anything left out there was dead. But down in that dark, warm cave, we kept each other alive. We stretched out our last bits of food and melted snow just to get by. Nalin would tell these old stories about our ancestors to keep the dark from driving us crazy. The kids would just huddle up under my coat and listen. I remember watching her brush her daughter's hair in that dim blue light. For the first time in years, seeing a family didn't just tear me apart. It actually brought me peace. They ended up saving me, too. Late January rolled around, and the deep freeze finally broke. The clouds parted, and this blinding sun came out over the peaks. The mountain went from a total nightmare to this quiet, beautiful sanctuary. We finally stepped out of that cave, just blinking in the bright sunlight. Standing there together, breathing in that crisp air, It felt like stepping into a brand new world.
We survived the deadliest winter in history.
Heading back down that mountain was slow going. But man, the whole vibe had completely changed. That heavy, suffocating feeling from the storm? It was just gone. Silas carried little Elu the whole way down. She was still bundled up tight in that massive bear coat of his. And for the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the weight of his past. He was actually carrying his future. Nalin walked right there beside him. You could tell she was exhausted, but her steps were steady. She stopped for just a second to look back up at those jagged peaks, just kind of taking in exactly what they had managed to survive. By midday, they finally hit the timberline. And there it was, Silas's little log cabin. It was practically buried under these massive snowdrifts. But that sturdy little place had actually held up against the worst of the blizzard. Inside, the cabin was absolutely freezing. That iron stove had gone cold days ago. They didn't even bother trying to light a fire, though. They just started grabbing whatever supplies and gear they had left. Silas walked over to the window and scraped away some of the frost. He looked way down toward the valley below. That's where the mining town was. A place packed with the exact kind of greed that sent Cobb after them in the first place. Nalin stepped up right next to him and looked down the mountain too. She just slowly shook her head. There was no way she was going back there. Not to a world full of corrupt men and fake justice. Silas looked at her and just gave this firm nod. They didn't even need to talk about it. Going south, back to civilization, was completely off the table. Instead, they looked north, toward the deep, untamed wilderness. They walked out of that cabin for the very last time. Silas pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind them. He adjusted his pack and took one last look around. This tiny place had been his whole world for 7 lonely years. With the sun shining bright overhead, they started trekking north, heading straight into those dense, endless pine forests. They were leaving all that pain and history behind them, stepping into a totally unknown future. Together. They never looked back at that mining town. They knew the valley was crawling with men driven by greed and cruelty, so they kept pushing north, deep into the untamed wild. Out here, the laws of nature were all that mattered. They started over, building a new life far from the reach of men. They were forged in the crucible of the deadliest winter in history. That kind of cold either breaks you or it binds you together forever. Survival is rarely just about enduring the physical elements. You can have all the fire and food in the world, but if you're empty inside, the cold will still find a way in. True survival requires a reason to keep breathing. It requires a connection, a real purpose. You need a spark of humanity that the freezing wind can't extinguish. For years, Silas thought he had buried that part of himself under the snow. He really believed he'd left his humanity behind. But he learned the hard way that as long as you're still drawing breath, it's never too late. It's never too late to stand up and fight for something greater than yourself. So, what would you do? Imagine being trapped in the freezing dark, with the temperature dropping and the wind screaming outside. Nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Imagine being hunted by desperate, ruthless men who won't stop until you're dead. With innocent lives depending entirely on your absolute will to survive. Could you hold the line? Could you have made the ultimate sacrifice? Or would the sheer terror of the cold have claimed your mind long before it ever claimed your body? It's a question you can't really answer until the blizzard hits. They survived the Great Die-Up because they found something worth living for. They didn't just beat the cold. They found their way back to life. I want to hear what you think. Could you have survived the deadliest winter in history? Let me know in the comments below. But the story doesn't end with Silas and Nalin. When the spring thaw of 1887 finally hit, it revealed a nightmare nobody was ready for.
The melting snow uncovered a totally ruined landscape.
Millions of cattle were lost to the ice, completely freezing the frontier economy.
The wealthy cattle barons who ruled the valleys were wiped out overnight.
That one brutal winter completely killed off the open range. Entire frontier towns buried under 20-foot snowdrifts just turned into ghost towns.
Those booming mining camps, driven by greed, were left completely abandoned.
It was a harsh reality check from nature. A lot of settlers came west thinking they could just conquer the land.
They built massive empires, but totally ignored the ancient warnings from indigenous tribes.
The Great Die-Up was the ultimate equalizer.
But while those empires crumbled, the people who actually respected the mountain's brutal honesty survived.
Indigenous folks and mountain men had the real knowledge it took to endure.
It was all about connection. If you go up into those jagged peaks today, you can still find those hidden geothermal caves. They sit up there completely quiet, just silent witnesses to that desperate fight for life. The steam still rises out of the rocks.
Far away from those ruined towns, Silas and Nalin actually managed to build a real life. They taught the girls the old ways of tracking and hunting.
They became living proof of human resilience.
Up in the high passes, artifacts of that deadly winter slowly started to thaw out.
You'd find things like a battered bowler hat, half buried in the mud. The mountain always reclaims everything in the end.
The legacy of the Great Die-Up completely changed the American frontier.
The stories of the people who froze in the dark turned into cautionary tales.
It marked the end of that wild, reckless expansion.
So, as we look back, we gotta honor the unnamed survivors who made it through the ice. The Rocky Mountains are still standing tall today.
It's a place of unbelievable beauty and terrifying power.
You know, surviving something like that isn't just about fighting off the frostbite.
It's a mental game. When the cold seeps into your bones, it tries to freeze your will to live, too.
You gotta find a reason to keep breathing when your body is screaming at you to just give up. For Silas, that reason walked right into his life when he least expected it. He found a connection, a real purpose out there in the absolute middle of nowhere. It was this tiny spark of humanity that even the deadliest winter in history couldn't snuff out.
The guy honestly thought his humanity had died years ago.
After losing his first family, he just checked out. He chose the brutal, freezing isolation of the mountains because, well, the mountain doesn't lie to you. It doesn't betray you. But the mountain ended up testing that vow in the hardest way possible.
He had to make a choice between his own safety and the lives of total strangers.
And by stepping up, he realized that as long as you're still breathing, it's never too late to fight for something bigger than yourself. So it really makes you wonder, right? What would you do? Imagine being trapped in the freezing, suffocating dark of a blizzard like that.
No rescue coming.
No way out. Just you and the ice. Now add a posse of desperate, ruthless killers hunting you down. Men who have absolutely nothing to lose and a massive bounty to gain.
They're tracking your every move through the snow, and they won't stop until you're dead.
And the kicker?
You've got innocent lives depending entirely on you.
If you fail, they die. The weight of that kind of responsibility is just unimaginable. You'd have to push past every physical and mental limit you have. Could you have made the ultimate sacrifice? Or would the sheer terror and the freezing cold have broken your mind before it even touched your body? That's the real horror of the Great Die-Up. It didn't just freeze people, it broke them.
It's a wild piece of history, isn't it?
A story about how far we'll go to survive and what it really takes to keep our humanity alive when the world goes completely dark. I'd love to hear what you guys think about Silas and Nalin's story. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Could you have survived the Great Die-Up? If you enjoyed this deep dive into frontier history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible survival stories. Stay warm out there, and I'll see you in the next one. While Silas and Nalin's story is incredible, it's just one piece of a massive puzzle. The winter of 1886 wasn't just cold, it was a continent-wide catastrophe known as the Great Die-Up. This single season fundamentally altered the American West forever. It was an extinction-level event for the frontier way of life. Before that brutal winter, the Great Plains were wide open. Massive herds of cattle used to roam completely free. But the relentless blizzards changed all of that. Millions of cattle literally froze solid right where they stood. The wealthy cattle barons saw their entire empires collapse overnight. The aftermath of the Great Die-Up marked the end of the open range. Survivors quickly realized you can't just conquer nature with arrogance. Soon after, the landscape was carved up by miles of barbed wire. The wild, untamed frontier was officially closing. Finding the kind of pure isolation Silas wanted became almost impossible. Beyond the lost money, the psychological toll was just immeasurable. Settlers trapped in tiny cabins for months faced severe trauma. The isolation and cabin fever were absolutely crushing. The silence of the deep snow was literally deafening. Many people's minds broke long before their bodies ever gave out. Silas Vance really represents a dying breed of the American mountain man. By the late 1880s, the solitary trapper was fading into myth. These men chose the brutal honesty of the wild over society. They wanted nothing to do with the corruption of the towns. They relied entirely on their own raw grit to stay alive. Nalin's survival highlights the incredible resilience of the Apache people. She had a deep ancestral knowledge of the harsh environment. Bounty hunters like Cobb just relied on brute force and guns. But Nalin used ancient techniques like packing boots with dried moss. She knew how to work with the mountain instead of fighting it. The contrast between Cobb and Silas is a fascinating study in survival psychology. Cobb was driven entirely by paranoia, greed, and fear. That desperate panic is exactly what pushed him to a reckless death. Silas, on the other hand, found a purpose greater than himself. Protecting that family gave him the ultimate will to endure. Modern science tells us exactly what happened to Cobb on that ridge. Severe hypothermia doesn't just freeze your blood. It severely impairs your brain's cognitive function. Victims get confused, erratic, and even feel sudden bursts of false warmth. It causes a terrifying madness right before the heart finally stops. Those geothermal caves serve as a powerful symbol of nature's duality. The same mountain that unleashed a freezing executioner also provided a sanctuary. It offered a miraculous hidden pocket of warmth in the dark. It's a stark reminder of how the wilderness really works. Nature isn't evil or kind. It's just completely indifferent. The legacy of the Great Die-Up is etched right into the Rocky Mountains. It stands as a testament to the absolute limits of human endurance. Some people managed to walk away from those frozen valleys. They forged entirely new lives out in the untamed wild. That winter was a crucible that burned away everything but their humanity. You know, surviving out there wasn't just about toughing out the cold. It was a total test of the human spirit against this massive, freezing void. When the wild strips away everything you got, your mind, becomes the real battlefield. True survival means finding a reason to keep pushing.
Especially when your own body is screaming at you to just lie down and go to sleep.
The cold tries to offer you this peaceful, quiet surrender. Fighting that urge, that takes a real anchor to the living world.
That anchor is connection. It's a shared purpose, a little spark of humanity that even the deadliest winter can't put out.
For Nalin and her girls, that connection was everything.
It was this fierce, unbreakable family bond. Silas Vance spent years trying to bury his own humanity. He hid it all under layers of grief and total isolation. He honestly thought he was just a ghost haunting those high peaks. But man, the mountain had totally different plans for him. He ended up learning the hardest lesson the frontier had to offer. As long as you're still breathing, it's never too late to fight for something bigger than yourself. His whole redemption was forged right in the middle of the great die-up.
So now, I gotta ask you something.
Imagine being violently thrown right into that freezing, pitch-black darkness.
Imagine feeling the suffocating weight of that mountain pressing down on you. What would you actually do? What would you do if you were trapped in that icy hell? Hunted by desperate, ruthless men who wanted you dead? Where every shadow hides a killer, and every gust of wind sounds like a dying breath. Picture innocent lives depending entirely on your absolute will to survive. Just looking up at you, trusting you to keep that freezing death away. The pressure of that is just unimaginable. Could you have made the ultimate sacrifice to protect them? Or would that relentless, agonizing cold have claimed your mind first, long before it finally claimed your body?
It's a question that still haunts the history of the West.
The Great Die-Up left behind a crazy legacy of ice, death, and miraculous survival. I really want to hear your thoughts on Silas and Nalin's incredible journey. Drop a comment below and let me know. How would you have handled the deadliest winter in history? They never went back to that mining town. They knew the valley was packed with guys like Cobb, driven by pure greed.
So they packed up and headed further north.
Out there, nature makes the rules. The trek north was long, but the air felt different. It wasn't that suffocating, freezing grip anymore. It was the crisp breath of a fresh start. The melting snow revealed rich earth and bright green pines. Together, they built a brand new life from the ground up. It was forged in the crucible of the deadliest winter in history. Every log they cut proved they survived it together. For the first time in months, real laughter echoed through the trees. Elu and her sister played in the thawing creeks. Silas watched them, realizing his decade of crushing grief was finally gone. Survival is rarely just about toughing out the elements. It takes a real reason to keep breathing when your body begs you to quit. It takes connection, purpose, and a spark of humanity. Silas honestly thought he left his humanity behind on those frozen peaks. He figured he was just a ghost waiting to fade. But he learned it's never too late to fight for something bigger. The Great Die-Up is still one of the most brutal chapters in Western history. It swallowed entire towns and froze millions of animals. But for one small family, it brought them back to life. So, what would you do if you were trapped in the freezing dark, hunted by desperate men? If innocent lives depended entirely on your will to survive, could you step up? Or would the cold have claimed your mind way before your body? The frontier tested human endurance in ways we can barely comprehend today. It forced ordinary people to become completely unbreakable. Their story is a true testament to that unbreakable spirit. Let me know in the comments how you'd handle the deadliest winter in history. Stay warm, stay safe,
and never stop fighting.